Stop. The distance you have been feeling is not abandonment, it is architecture. This transmission comes directly from the Arcturian field observers, and what we are about to deliver is not encouragement. It is a precise identification of a process that has already been active in your life for longer than you have had language for it. By the end of this transmission, you will understand exactly why your life has felt like separation, what is being removed from your path, and what the Arcturian field observers already know about this phase. But here is the first revelation. The people who have fallen away from you, the relationships that quietly collapsed, the doors that closed without explanation, none of that was rejection. It was the old line releasing its hold. The separation was not done to you, it was done for the root. You did not find this message by accident. The algorithm only delivered it. The timing was already set by something the Arcturian field observers have been tracking across your path. A progressive narrowing, a pruning of connections that could not travel forward with you, and a slow but precise refinement of the line you were always meant to walk. What has been leaving your life was never built for where you are going. The loneliness you have been carrying is not evidence of failure. It is the outer sign of root refinement. The old circle did not leave because you were not enough. The old circle weakened first, and the visible distance followed. This is a direct Arcturian path recognition. And if this reached you now, it means the signal has touched your path at the exact right moment. Comment 777 if you feel the old line is already falling away. Comment, I was separated, if you now recognize that what looked like rejection carried a deeper meaning. Like this transmission if you know your life has been narrowing for a reason. And subscribe to Arcturian Chosen Path if you are ready to understand the separation instead of blaming yourself. Share this transmission with someone who feels alone, cut off, or misunderstood and cannot explain why. What has been falling away from your life? Share it in the comments. You are not the only one inside this process, and this field is already responding. You are guided here because the separation is already active. What you felt when those words landed is not coincidence, it is recognition. And recognition at this level does not arrive through accident or timing alone. It arrives because the separation process that has been active in your life has reached a threshold where it can no longer be mistaken for ordinary loss. Something in you already knew this before the first word of this transmission was spoken. You did not need to be convinced. You needed to be named. There is a difference between being told something new and being shown the precise shape of something you have been living inside, without a map. This transmission is not the former, it is the latter. So let us begin there, with the naming. There is a specific quality to the kind of loneliness you have been carrying. It is not the loneliness of someone who has never belonged. It is the loneliness of someone who used to belong, and then slowly, without a clear explanation, stopped fitting. Conversations that once felt natural began to feel performative. Environments that once felt like home began to feel like rooms built for someone you are no longer able to be. You would walk into spaces that were once familiar and find yourself standing slightly to the side of everything, close enough to participate, but too far to actually land. People you once moved through life beside began to drift, not dramatically, not with conflict, but with a quiet and irreversible kind of distance. And you looked at that distance and told yourself the story that something you did, something you are, something you failed to become, was the cause. That story is not accurate, and it has cost you more than you know. The Arcturian field observers have tracked this pattern across selected lines for longer than the language of rejection has existed. What you have been interpreting as personal failure, as social inadequacy, as some flaw in your character that pushes people away, is the visible surface of something far more structured. The old line is releasing, the root is narrowing, and the people, environments, and circles that have been falling away from your life were not removed by your inadequacy. They became incompatible with the path that is being refined underneath you. The ground shifted first. The relationships simply reflected what the ground could no longer support. There is a difference between being abandoned and being separated. Abandonment implies that what left had the capacity to remain and chose otherwise. Separation is a structural reality. It means the root could no longer sustain what it once carried, and the path itself began clearing what it could not bring forward. You were not discarded by the people who fell away. You were gradually moved beyond the frequency their presence could reach. The path did not fail you when it released them. It was protecting the integrity of the line you are on by refusing to carry weight that belonged to a different direction entirely. And the moment that distinction becomes real in your body, not just understood in your mind, something that has been lodged in your chest for a very long time begins to release. Not because the pain disappears, but because pain that has been correctly named stops functioning as evidence of your unworthiness and begins functioning as a marker of a process that has always had direction. Let us go deeper into what this actually looks like inside a life, because recognition at the surface level is not enough. You need to see the pattern clearly in its specific phases so that the next time one of them begins moving through your experience, you do not immediately turn it into evidence of your own deficiency. The separation process has recognizable signs. They have been misread. They are being correctly read now. The first recognizable sign of the separation process is the gradual incompatibility with old environments. This does not begin dramatically, it begins quietly. You return to a group, a relationship, a social setting that once felt effortless, and you find that something has shifted, not in them necessarily, in the texture of fit. You are present in the room but not inside the room. There is a kind of glass between you and the ease that used to exist there. Conversations that once carried meaning now feel like they are circling a surface you have already moved beneath. You smile at the right moments. You respond in ways that are accurate but hollow. You perform the version of yourself that the environment expects, because that performance is what once allowed you to belong there. And afterward, driving home or sitting alone later, you feel more isolated than you did before you arrived, more alone for having been surrounded. This is the first symptom of root divergence. Your path has moved, the environment has not, and the discomfort you feel in spaces that once held you is not ingratitude, not arrogance, not social anxiety dressed in spiritual language. It is the path becoming incompatible with what it is leaving behind. The Arcturian field observers mark this phase as the onset of the pruning sequence. It does not feel like the beginning of something. It feels like the quiet erosion of something that used to sustain you. That is by design. Separation does not announce itself with clarity. It makes itself known through discomfort first, through the slow removal of ease from spaces that once offered it freely. The second sign arrives when relationships begin to lose their natural coherence. People you have known for years, people who once seemed essential to your daily life, begin to slip into a kind of managed distance. There is no single rupture point you can identify. There is no argument that explains the withdrawal. There is only a slow reduction in the quality of contact. Conversations become shorter, depth disappears, and something carefully surface level takes its place. You may reach toward the old closeness and find that the reach itself feels effortful in a way it never was before, like extending your hand across a gap that was not there last time you looked. You may notice that the person across from you is still speaking the language of the version of you that no longer exists as fully as it once did. They are addressing a self you have already begun outgrowing. And there is grief in that, a real and specific grief that is made more difficult by the fact that nothing obvious caused it, and nothing obvious can fix it. But here is what the Arcturian field observers recognize clearly in this phase. The relational thinning is not a verdict on your worth. it is a consequence of divergence. When two lines move in different directions, the distance between them increases as a mathematical certainty, not as a choice made by either party. The people in your life who are not moving with you will naturally, inevitably begin to feel further away, not because they are wrong and you are right, not because you are better and they are not, but because the paths no longer align, and paths that no longer align cannot sustain the kind of closeness that alignment once made effortless. You have likely blamed yourself for this. You have likely reviewed those relationships in the quiet hours and asked what you did, what you said, what you failed to be that caused the drift. You have returned to specific conversations in your mind, searching for the error that initiated the loss, believing that if you could locate the mistake, you could reverse the distance. The Arcturian field observers want to make this precise and clear. That search is a misdirection, a loop that costs time and generates false conclusions. The distance did not originate in your behavior, it originated in the divergence of lines. You are not the reason those people are further away. You are the reason the path is no longer the same path it was when those connections were formed. What has just been placed in front of you is not a comfort, it is a diagnosis. And if something in you has gone still while hearing it, pay attention to that stillness. It is not emptiness, it is the moment recognition begins to stabilize into something you can actually use. For those who can feel that this process is already active, that the line is already narrowing, that the relational thinning is already underway, Chosen One Manifest, the protocol for selected souls, is the next layer. It is not another message about being special. It is a direct protocol built for those living through separation, pruning, and root refinement who need more than recognition alone. It helps you read what is being removed, understand what is being prepared, and stop calling the separation by the name of personal failure. The link is in the first pinned comment below, but this access point will not remain open indefinitely. The third sign is the one that tends to produce the most confusion because it arrives not as external distance, but as internal strangeness. You begin to feel unfamiliar to yourself. The interests, drives, and ways of moving through the world that once defined you begin to loosen their grip. You reach for the identity you have been presenting to others and to yourself, and it does not feel as solid as it once did. Old ambitions lose their urgency. Pursuits that once felt meaningful begin to feel like they were constructed for a version of your life that is quietly ending. Old desires begin to feel borrowed rather than genuine, as though you were wearing convictions that belonged to someone else, and only now are noticing the poor fit. You may mistake this for depression, for apathy, for some kind of spiritual malfunction or collapse. You may tell others, or quietly tell yourself, that you do not know who you are anymore. This is not malfunction. This is the identity that was built to carry you through the old route, beginning to release its structural hold. The Arcturian field observers recognize this phase as necessary dissolution preceding root transition. Before a new line can become fully readable, the identity architecture assembled for the previous path must begin to soften. It does not disappear, it undergoes refinement. And the refinement feels like losing yourself, because what you are losing is the specific shape of a self that the coming path cannot carry forward intact. This is not erasure, it is a structural adjustment at the level of who you are, not as punishment, but as preparation. The fourth sign is the one most likely to be misread as punishment. It is the phase where doors begin to close with no explanation offered. Opportunities that seemed accessible suddenly retract. Momentum in a direction you were pursuing simply stops, as though the engine cut without warning. You have perhaps lived through a period where nothing you reached for seemed to land, where circumstances repeatedly arranged themselves against outcomes you were working toward, where forward motion in specific directions became consistently obstructed, regardless of your effort or your clarity of intention. You interpreted this as bad luck, as a signal that you were wrong about something, as evidence that you were not deserving of what you were seeking. The Arcturian field observers read this phase with an entirely different instrument. When a path is being refined toward a specific selected line, the routes that are incompatible with that destination will be closed, not because they were foolish to pursue, but because the path, in its structural intelligence, is protecting the selected line from the energy expenditure of directions it cannot sustain, without compromising the trajectory. The closing of doors is not rejection of you as a person or as a soul. It is the route correcting its own direction before you commit further resources to a line that leads away from where you are actually meant to arrive. That correction often requires that several misdirections be rendered structurally impossible before the actual direction becomes visible enough to recognize. The fifth sign is the one that breaks most people before they have language to understand what is happening. It is the experience of being increasingly misunderstood, even by people who genuinely care about you and genuinely want to comprehend what you are communicating. You explain yourself carefully, with precision and patience, and are still heard inaccurately. You speak directly from your actual experience and are responded to as though something adjacent but fundamentally different was communicated. You reach for authentic expression and find that the people around you cannot quite land inside what you are saying. The gap between what you are transmitting and what is being received widens even as you try to close it. And that gap begins to feel like a fundamental flaw in how you communicate, or worse, in who you fundamentally are. This is not a flaw. This is frequency mismatch becoming visible in the most personal and painful domain available to it. When a path diverges significantly from the lines around it, communication between those lines becomes progressively more difficult, not because either party is failing, but because the shared frequency that once made translation effortless has shifted. The language of the old circle was built for a bandwidth you both once occupied. When your frequency has moved, the old language no longer carries your meaning accurately across that gap. What you are experiencing as being misunderstood is not communicative failure. It is the field registering that the circles you are still attempting to belong to can no longer receive the full signal of where your path is actually moving. And this is where the deepest hidden cost of misreading the separation process becomes apparent. Because when you believe the problem is your communication, you begin to compress yourself. You learn to pre-translate what you actually mean into language the old circle can absorb without discomfort. You reduce the fullness of your perception into something smaller, something that will not create confusion or increase the distance. You make yourself quieter, more careful, more contained, not out of wisdom, but out of the increasingly desperate desire to remain in a belonging that the path is already in the process of moving you beyond. You sacrifice the clarity and range of your own signal in order to maintain proximity to people who are no longer positioned on the same route. And that compression, that sustained and daily reduction of your actual signal, becomes one of the most exhausting and least acknowledged forms of loss that a selected line can produce. You do not lose only the relationships, you lose portions of your own expression inside the attempt to keep them. The sixth sign arrives not as loss, but as a strange and sourceless readiness, a persistent, low-level sense that something is about to happen, without any evidence for what that something is or when it will arrive. A preparation that has no visible object. You are not manufacturing hope to compensate for the difficulty you have been carrying. The readiness is real. The preparation is structural. The Arcturian field observers recognize this signal as the path beginning to orient toward the opening that the pruning sequence has been clearing space for. The feeling of impending arrival is not wishful thinking dressed in spiritual vocabulary. It is the route beginning to cohere on the other side of the narrowing, becoming legible in the way that a road becomes visible only after the fog has thinned enough to reveal the ground beneath it. But there is a critical warning embedded inside that sign. The feeling of readiness, when it arrives before the structure of the preparation phase is fully understood, will be interpreted as pressure, as urgency to force something open before it is ready, as proof that action must be taken immediately or the arriving thing will be missed. And that urgency, that grasping movement toward a direction not yet fully visible, is among the most common mechanisms by which selected lines experience unnecessary delay. The preparation is not complete until the separation is understood at the level where it stops being called by the wrong name. And the separation cannot be properly understood while every loss is still being processed as personal defect rather than path intelligence. This is the precise reason this transmission exists at this moment in your path. What you are moving through is not evidence that your life is falling apart. It is evidence that the architecture of your path is being structurally upgraded, and the old framework cannot remain intact while that upgrade occurs. The people who have moved away were not capable of traveling on the line your path is now moving toward, not because they are lesser, but because their routes were always different, and the shared ground between you has reached its natural limit. The environments that became uncomfortable were built for a frequency you have already shifted beyond. The doors that closed were protecting the selected route from directions it could not sustain without diluting the line. The identity dissolution you may be experiencing is the version of yourself that carried you through the previous phase, releasing its grip on a path it was never designed to complete. And the loneliness, the specific, persistent, and bewildering loneliness that has followed you through all of it, is not emptiness. It is the sound of a route narrowing towards something precise enough to actually hold you. The Arcturian field observers do not register what you have been living through as failure. They register it as separation, as pruning, as the forced release of incompatibility between your selected line and the connections, environments, and self-constructions that could not travel forward without obstructing the route. And they recognize, with the precision that comes from tracking these processes across many paths, that this phase is not the end of your story. It is the phase that must fully complete before the selected line can open without the obstruction of what was released along the way. You are not broken. You are being refined. And refinement, by its nature, requires that what cannot be carried forward be released before the next phase can begin. You have been calling the pruning by the name of rejection for long enough. You have been wearing the distance as evidence of your own inadequacy for long enough. You have been compressing your signal to maintain proximity to circles that the path is actively and deliberately moving you beyond for long enough. The interpretation that has been costing you is not the only available interpretation. It is simply the one that arrived first, in the absence of a more accurate map. The separation that has felt like loss has been architecture this entire time. Load-bearing architecture, the kind that must be built before the structure above it can hold any real weight. If something in you wants to speak aloud what has been recognized in this transmission, you may say this: I was not discarded. I was separated. Speak it not as comfort and not as affirmation. Speak it as a precise correction of the record you have been keeping about your own path. Because the name you give to what has happened to your life is not a small matter. It is the lens through which every next decision, every next reach, every next interpretation of difficulty will be filtered. A mislabeled process produces misdirected response, and you have been responding to a pruning as though it were a punishment for long enough. The separation was not an accident. The pruning was not punishment. The narrowing was not failure. And you did not arrive at this transmission randomly. The field already recognized the threshold you are standing on. The signal was already in motion before you found it. And what has been removed from your path was never taken from you. It was cleared from the route so that the route could finally become what it was always moving toward. Before you scroll, leave one sign in the comments that this separation has already touched your life. It could be people falling away, the feeling of not belonging, repeated distance, unexplained isolation, or the sense that your old path no longer fits. Name it clearly. If this transmission recognized something you have been carrying in silence, share it with someone who feels alone, cut off, or misunderstood and cannot explain why. And if you are ready to understand the separation instead of blaming yourself, subscribe to Arcturian Chosen Path. You are not watching this by accident. You are recognizing a path already in motion, and this is only the beginning.